So my name's Paule Constable and I am a UK-based lighting designer for the stage. My journey into lighting was a journey of surprise, really. I often say it's as if light discovered me rather than I discovered it. Um, I had, when I left school, I had a kind of strange mix of sciences and arts subjects that I'd specialised in. In the UK, we specialise in 3 or 4 subjects through our last couple of years of school, and that's supposed to inform what you do. And people kind of go, surely you're a scientist or you're an artist or a social scientist, or, that your choices are very clear. And my subjects were double maths, physics, history of art, and English. And everybody kept on saying to me, you've got to make your mind up. And I very much felt that I didn't want to make my mind up one way or the other, and that I was looking for something that had a foot in both sort of very logistical and very kind of creative thinking. I didn't find it. I considered reading architecture, but also sort of realised that was going to be quite dry. So I actually did an English degree in London. And it was while I was doing an English degree that my flatmate, who was a stage manager from Guildhall, had, if this is in the days before email or mobile phones, she had a summer job at the Hackney Empire. And instead of going to work, she had met this guy, Crispin, and she'd fallen madly in love and run away to Spain. And she hadn't told them. So they phoned our flat, our council flat on the Isle of Dogs, and said, could Jackie be at work the next morning at 9 in the morning? And I still to this day don't know why. I didn't say she's gone away to Spain. I just went, yep. And I turned up and I pretended to be her. And it was amazing. It was sort of partly also the journey was helped by the fact that when I got to the Hackney Empire, and remember this is in the sort of mid 1980s when there were fewer women working in this industry than there are now. So I was sort of in this theatre not having the faintest idea really what I was doing. But fortunately, the other follow spot operator at the time was also a woman. And I felt able to say to her, I'm not Jackie and I've got no idea what I'm doing. And she's like, it's fine, I'll talk you down. So I got involved with the show. It was a rock and roll musical. It was hugely good fun. There was lots of trussing, lots of parkans. I'd been a climber as a kid, was very happy to join in, and I sort of sometimes describe it as love at first light. I sort of realized there was this amazing sort of tribe of people working backstage who were unlike any group of people I'd met before. And me loving being at height and clambering around was great. And sort of through the technical backstage world, I discovered this thing called lighting design. So I worked in the music industry for a few years while I was doing my degree in London. And then I shifted into working in experimental and fringe theatre. And then that's really been my journey. So I have no formal training. I've learned everything on the job. When I started working, sort of helping out backstage at the Hackney Empire, the rig had been put in by a rock and roll company called Midnight Design, and they sort of took to me and I took to them. So for the next couple of years, I sort of freelanced with them, but they also invested quite a lot of time in, just giving me work so I could keep learning while I was working. So I spent quite a lot of time working in a rock and roll warehouse, doing odd bits of touring. I worked in a lot of London venues for them, and they sort of supported me through making a lot of terrible mistakes. So that kind of it's sort of unofficial mentorship is something I received a lot of, partly through them to start with. I then, when I started working in sort of experimental and fringe theatre, I worked with companies like Deviate and People Show and Lumiere and Son. And I was just really interested. So I think people gave me the time of day because I was enthusiastic, but also I wanted to learn. And I was aware that I had a lot to learn. So I was kind of the irritating, very keen kid who would ask a lot of questions, be always willing to be there, doing whatever it took to kind of watch and learn from seeing work being made. Uh, I think that unofficial kind of form of mentorship is still a really valuable way to learn. Um, and that, yeah, that's as formal as it ever really got. There were a couple of lighting designers who took me on as an assistant-y associate kind of person. It's much more formal, that kind of role now, than it was then. So Ben Ormerod was a big supporter of mine. There was an American lighting designer called Stevie Whitson who I did a lot of work with. Um, and then the other thing is that, particularly in sort of fringe and experimental theatre at the time, there were a lot of amazing women working as producers. So People Show, who I worked with a lot, they were run by a woman, Glynis Henderson. Um, People like Hilary Westlake, who ran Lumiere and Son, that kind of fringe world of the late 80s, early 90s, had a lot of really positive, very strong female role models around. And I think that was very formative to me as well. Oh, the kind of projects I work on now. I mean, I do find myself in quite a strange position now, because I think when you meet a lot of younger ones nowadays, they have a really strong sense of where they want to go and what they want to be, and that they sort of aspire to have a certain level of success. Um, for me, when I started working in theatre and live events, I felt that I'd run away and joined the circus. So the thing about joining the circus is it wasn't a career, it was just what I did. Um, and, I have the privilege of growing up in a period where the welfare state was alive and well, where I didn't pay for my education that I had, so my English degree. Um, and I actually switched my degree to English with drama because I liked reading plays and I liked practical criticism. But I was able to do that. It was like nobody was asking me, what are you going to do when you grow up? I mean, I think people still wonder what I'm going to do when I grow up. But so when I find myself now working at the Metropolitan Opera or at the National Theatre, or, on these amazing projects that I'm sort of really privileged to work on, that was never a plan. I never had a plan. The plan was essentially, once I discovered this thing called lighting, and then discovered this thing called lighting design, and then discovered people who I liked making work with, many of whom were women, and who were actually the real people who taught me what it was to be a designer. So my fellow designers, not necessarily lighting designers, but women like Vicky Mortimer and Ray Smith, and directors like Marianne Elliott, Katie Mitchell. We all grew up together, and part of what drew us to each other was the fact that we were women and were working in sort of similar areas of oppression and patriarchy, let's be honest. So, in a way, the important thing for me was the politics of what we were doing, but also just the doing of it. I didn't do it because I wanted a career. I did it because I wanted sort of to change the world. So now, yes, I work in what could be seen as very legitimate, very perhaps conventional theatre and opera, but I still have the same criteria for jobs that I take. I have to believe that with any project I do, I have to believe there's a reason for me to be doing it, and that I have a compulsion to be part of telling that story. So I have this kind of ridiculous graph of how I make decisions as to how I make work. And it's 5 really simple questions that I ask myself, and it's in no particular order, but it's what it is. So is it a piece that I want to be part of telling and bringing alive? Does it have politics that I agree with, that interests me? Is it telling a story that I want to share? It's who it's with, and that's obviously the rest of the creative team, but also the personnel resources that will be available to me. Will I be on my own? Will I have a network around me that helps me to make good work? Will I be able to sort of make a situation where I can do well in, or I do the best I possibly can in that situation. Then there's the question of time. Do I have enough time to give to that project to make it as good as it's going as I hope it could be? And different projects require different amounts of time, and actually being honest with yourself about that. And then money, and that's not literally how much are they going to pay me, but am I willing to take it on for the amount that I will be paid for it? I'm really happy to do stuff for free if I know why, and as long as from the outset that's the agreement. And then the last question for me is also where it is. Not so important now in terms of geography, but when my kids were younger, that was really important. Would it take me away from home? Is it a building where I feel welcome? Is it a building where I feel I can do good work? So I suppose now the one thing about being in some ways successful is that I can be more specific about what I need to do my best work. And also, I think I've always tried to make good decisions about the work I do. You're only as good as the decisions you make in this industry. So I think they're really critical. I suppose that the process of making work for me starts with the conversation that we were just having about the criteria for what work you take on. So the sort of step one, as it were, is the decision to take something on. And then I quite often describe the process of lighting a show is a little bit like being in a holding pattern above Heathrow and getting closer and closer and closer to landing. And it's too many metaphors, but I'll keep going. So while you're in that holding pattern, you're kind of looking for clues, because we all know that one of the things that's sort of maddest about lighting is how hard it is to talk about. And also, if you single it out with a director or a designer, it can get really sort of mundane. Um, so I often think of there's the kind of decision to make a show, and then depending upon what the scale of show is, quite often there's a kind of through the model process that the designer's going through that will involve you to a certain extent. And once the designer and director have sort of decided the way they want to tell a story, then I become involved in terms of how light participates in that conversation. I always think, for me as a lighting designer, I'm not an artist. I'm not an artist, I'm a designer, and I don't generate work. I don't think up the ideas. I respond to something. So a director and designer might go, okay, we're doing La Boheme and we're going to set it on the moon, or we're doing, Uncle Vanya and we're going to put it in a submarine, or we're going to have a completely empty space, or whatever it is, whatever that process is, that the kind of provocation, that's the point at which I come in and go, okay, if we're in a submarine, what's the function of light? Or if we're in a completely open space, what's the function of light in this sort of process of storytelling? So those sort of decisions tend to be made very early on by me. That kind of, in a way, what makes light walk into the room, whether the room is the stage or a literal room or whatever it is, but what brings light into this conversation and what is the character of that light. So I'll work using those elements through the kind of design and model process and budgeting. But then there's the kind of world of rehearsal, which is the kind of next bit of your sort of orbit above Heathrow, which is as the piece comes to life, sort of mentally testing the ideas and the elements that you've brought into the room, but also how the rig is going to move, and also how you're going to sort of shift and breathe and make light participate in that storytelling. So I sort of go from decision to make a show to landscape for what light is in a show, to the kind of nitty gritty of how light moves and breathes in a show. And all of those elements then I kind of make into quite an ordered sort of spreadsheet of like ideas and cues, as it were, pictures. And then at that point, I sort of hit the theatre and start what we would call a formal technical process, where I start to make those pictures into a reality. I do tend to be really organised, partly because one of the things that's frustrating with how we have to work in live performance is being able to work quickly and also being able to look. So I like to do all my thinking, like put all my cues in the script or in the score or whatever it is, all of that beforehand. Not because I want to fix the ideas, but because I want to fix a framework within which I can work. So the more that I go, this is what happens here, this is what happens here, this is what happens here, all of that can change, but everybody understands that that's our starting point. And that also frees me up in the tech to kind of make something very quickly and then be free to look and respond and learn. So I hope that sort of answers the question. It's like this kind of period of sort of looking for clues, looking for clues, looking for clues. Then you gather all this information up in a sort of place, make it into some kind of order, and then you hit the stage and you sort of throw these ideas at the stage. And then you can sort of sit back and look and see what's kind of working and what the thing is, the kind of alchemy of something becoming alive, which however much you sort of talk and think about something and do your sections and work in 3D, when you actually sit in front of it, how light interacts with surface, performer, moment, breath is all something that is alchemical and you will only discover in the moment. So it's sort of creating a framework which allows you to be free. It's funny with the idea of restrictions. I mean, it's like when we talk about the tyranny of a blank sheet of paper. And I don't know whether it's right to think about things as restrictions or more about parameters. I think the more that you engage with the kind of reality of how you're delivering something and you wrestle with the questions, the difficult bits of it, that's quite often where the most kind of creative responses can come. As designers, we have a responsibility to deliver within budget, within very, very restricted time frames, because time is money in live performance. So we have to work. We have to work with the time we've got. We can't push people to work beyond that. We have to work in the spaces we've got with the gear, with the gear that's available. It doesn't matter how brilliant your ideas are, if you can't communicate them and deliver them with the resources available to you, then your ideas aren't worth anything. So, the clue is in the title, lighting designer. If you want to be a light artist and work with a kind of blank page and entirely in terms of abstract creative thought about light, that's a different thing. We work in the theatre and performance, and that's a very collaborative world. So one could say it's restricted, but one could also say that it's defined. One could say that it's problematic, but also, the more that there's something to rub against, I think the more interesting work becomes. The more, some of the most interesting design work I've done, I think, is within designs which look almost impossible to bring to life. If I think about something like Angels in America, which I did at the National, the brief for that show, what the designer came up with, what we had to deliver that, part of you can go, that feels terrifying and impossible. But actually, if you step into that space of impossibility, then it's also going to create more interesting work. Something like Curious Incident, which was a show I did, which was hugely successful and, was seen by a lot of young people in the West End in the States. That's got an incredibly restricted idea around how we lit it. But actually, I think most shows that I do are hung on one or two ideas, quite often very simple ideas that relate to the design process. Again, going back to that idea of what's the light, what brings light into the room, what brings this idea to life. And quite often that can be something really simple, but then you really invest in the simple, and somehow that can make something more cohesive. I've always had this thing about doing shows that quite often when I'm approaching something, I really love to try and go and see something else to put my head into a different space. So if I'm really worrying about a show and really kind of churning it, like I remember the classic time for me with this was I was doing this show called Street of Crocodiles with Theatre de Complicité at the National, and I was a baby designer, and I was really anxious about the whole thing. And 3 days before we went into the theatre, David Bourne was playing at the Town and Country Club. I mean, this is 1993. And my partner Ian and I, and Ray, the designer on the show, and a bunch of us I kidnapped Ray from work, who was designing the show we were working on, and we all just went to the Town and Country Club and just had this amazing moment of like I sort of describe it sometimes as a kind of design sorbet. It's like you sort of plunge yourself into someone else's idea world, and you sort of, if it's good, you realize the joy of being in someone else's head and how sort of stimulating that is and how stimulating design is, whether it's going to see an exhibition or a really brilliant movie or, I think we can get very stuck on what we're doing, and it's really important somehow to empty your head, clean your head, cleanse your head, sorbet your head. The other thing I do a lot of that really helps that process for me is running. And it's running is, yeah, it keeps me fit, but also the other thing it does every day for me is it gets me outside. And most of the ideas and the sort of world that I work in and that I'm drawn to with light, I love the idea of light and landscape, and I love the idea of kind of, the extremity of sort of natural light and how it moves and shifts. And I, I feel very in tune with that. And going for a run, even on a totally grey day, I live very close to the sea, and if I get up early, I can always see the sunrise because there'll always be that moment before the grey clouds take over. And Brighton is just really, it has amazing light. But even in the grimmest of greyest cities on the grimmest of greyest days, it's still great to get outside and see light and the world out there, and just try and capture a little bit of that and bring it into the theatre in its essence. So they're the kind of things that I do. I look to externally for ideas, other artists working, other designers, a sense of plunging into other ideas, but then this sense of landscape. I mean, I love mountains and the ocean and big open spaces. I spend it all the time when I'm not working. I'm outdoors. And then in terms of inspiration within the industry, um, I do find, particularly those very close relationships that I have with designers like Vicky Mortimer and Ray Smith, just keying into their idea world, that their ideas, their world of ideas, but also just that thing about how we talk to each other. Vicky and I made Follies at the National Theatre, and that people quite often, or people talk about Warhorse and where did those ideas come from, and you go, well, that's 20 years of conversation between Ray and myself, and understanding and kind of a mutual sense of each other's work and learning together. So I think I love that sense of my colleagues sort of challenging and provoking me into new ideas and kind of new ways of bringing things to life. So there's a kind of, and I do go and see other people's work as well, and I find that inspiring at times, exasperating at other times, um, uh, uh, complicated at other times, but never boring. It's always worth seeing what other people are doing. Um, so yeah, lots of places to be inspired by. I think one of the things I find quite interesting about lighting is that I remember doing a day's rehearsal once with a composer in the room, and one of the actors was talking about a piece of music they were using to improvise to in the morning, and said, "Oh, but I really, that was great." And he was playing something else at the time, and she said, "Oh, let's just keep going. That piece we had this morning that you're playing now." And he was like, "These two pieces of music are completely different," but to her, she wasn't really hearing the detail of the music. And I think that that's quite true with light. I think as lighting designers, we're sort of training ourselves constantly to look at quality of light and sort of image and what light's doing. But I don't think everybody sees that way. and it's like we're sort of tuning ourselves into light. So I do find, as I was saying, light in the everyday incredibly interesting, inspiring, weird, sort of bonkers. Um, and that's out there to find all the time, isn't it? Or even in here, in this gorgeous LED lit meeting room. But that in itself is something you can capture and put on stage at any point. So it's all useful. It's just filling your head with it, isn't it? And you need to make sure that you fill your head with something which isn't just work. I think that's so important. Like filling your head with kind of a visual, you have to be visually articulate to do this job, and filling your kind of tank with that, be it conversations about understanding ideas or looking in other people's work, and sort of articulating where those ideas are coming from, or seeing films with very strong kind of physical identities. All of those things is just like filling your tank of ideas and understanding up, and that's your job, really. And the biggest challenge of my career, dealing with everyday misogyny. That's a quick one to answer. I've just experienced it for the first time in quite a long time. I mean, there's kind of everyday sort of patriarchal misogyny within systems that we barely even register because we're so used to it. I have just recently worked with somebody where it was absolute, overt, outright. I don't want a woman to be sitting in the seat that you're sitting in, and it was actually totally ridiculous. He looked like the fool to the point where other people noticed it as well. Um, but yeah, that's been the biggest challenge of my career, without a doubt. Proudest moments. I mean, it's hard. I'm sort of really proud that I've survived. Um, and I'm incredibly uh, sort of I sort of really acknowledge the people who've helped me to do that, and the community that I have, that gives me somewhere safe to be and somewhere where I can be honest about what it's like. Um, it, I mean, pinnacles and things like that are difficult, aren't they? Because there are external accolades that one receives, which are incredibly generous, and I'm incredibly fortunate to have received quite a lot of awards and to have my work acknowledged. Uh, and all of that's of huge value, and it raises the profile of women doing the job that I do, and I think that that's valuable, and I'm proud to be a woman who has achieved what I have done, and I hope that can inspire other women to know that it's possible. But the real question as a lighting designer is the shows that you walk away from where you feel in your heart of hearts that you've done a job that is in some way close to what is possible. And I suppose for me, there are a few shows where I go, I think I did that okay. So Follies for me, for example, would be a show that I genuinely felt proud of. I felt proud of the quality of collaboration and conversation and my contribution to the whole of that. I feel really proud of that piece of work. And also, the funny thing about the job that I do is it's gone. No one else will ever see it. There's some beautiful images of it. There's an NT Live of it, but NT Live is a terrible representation of what lighting is. So, there is actually no record of what it was like being in the room with that live event. There's no record of it. Um, so, yeah, there were a few shows that I'm proud of having been part of, but uh, I just I am about to start. I mean, I've got 2 more years of working, and then for a lot of very complicated reasons, I'm not going to do this anymore. Um, Partly because I always said I should stop while I still love it, and also it's a really healthy form of allyship is to make space for new people. And I think also too often people define themselves by their job, and there's lots of other things that interest me, or that I can put my energy into other things that feel valuable. And so in some ways, that makes one of the reasons that I feel able to do that, I think, is that I do feel proud of the body of work that I've created. I feel that I've been incredibly lucky to be in certain rooms and to help participate in bringing certain pieces of work alive and to be part of certain other artists' journeys. So, yeah, that's probably the most important thing. It's a really hard question to answer. One of the reasons why I'm feeling that my time in the industry is waning is partly because of the way technology is changing. So I've been very involved in the kind of, of course, in our industry, we're shifting away from tungsten, we're shifting into LED mixing, and I've been very involved with a couple of campaigns with the EU to try and ensure that theatre can maintain the use of light in the kind of painterly way that we use it in performance. And that's a kind of long sidebar story that I won't bore you with now. And uh, I am interested in very interested in environmentally responsible work. But of course, I find it hugely frustrating as well that everybody says that the answer to being more environmentally responsible is to, for instance, shift everything to LED. That move is not necessarily the answer. Greenwash is a very real thing, but also, Philips 15 years ago gave up all their research around tungsten and focused all their efforts around LED technology, partly because you're creating a new market. If you create obsolescence, you create huge capital, commercial potential. The push for new green technologies is the most green thing that we can do in any industry is reduce, reuse, and recycle. Using old gear for a long time is often more energy efficient than creating huge amounts of obsolescence. But because we don't look at old gear and the recycling of that and what can be reused, we don't think of it in those terms. So everyone goes, LED is the answer. So that's partly why I'm giving up, is that I want to get involved more in that part of the conversation, but also that the tools that we are using now, I definitely grew up in a world where I think in tungsten. Nothing makes me happier than a parkan. I just love them. And now when I'm using LED technology, I'm quite often using it to ape a quality of light that doesn't exist anymore. And when I think about what the kind of new generation are working with, they will think in LED. They won't be thinking in tungsten. And I think that I need to pass that baton on in a way. And the other thing that's come out, particularly through the pandemic, is this whole conversation about digital and where digital sits within the live performance world. And my love of live performance absolutely sits in the space that I love it because it's live. I love the fact that you can't control it. I love the fact it's always different. I love those moments in a theatre where everybody leans forward and leans in or starts breathing together. I don't want to create hybrid work. That's not for me. That's for the next generation. So I sort of think, again, I can step aside and leave space for that. So I am really interested in technology, and I think particularly around control, where we are with lighting control systems and the flexibility of tools that we have. There are many brilliant things, but that we're also losing many things. And for me now, I'm losing more than I'm gaining. And I sort of have a nostalgia, which I don't think is necessarily useful for the world in terms of the future. So I think it's time to leave space for people who are excited by more of that technological change than I am. So technology is an amazing thing, but I'm also very wary of when the tail is wagging the dog. And for me, that balance is certainly tipping. advice to women. I I I think the thing that's kept me going, my if I was to think about the safe spaces that I've had through the darkest moments of my career, um, it's definitely the relationships I have with other women. So the women set designers that I've worked with, set and costume designers who've been really central to my journey. Um, so I've mentioned Vicky, I've mentioned Ray, Bunny Christie. Um, there's there's something about working with women of my generation that they've given me incredible sort of solace, and also somewhere where we can be incredibly honest about what the experience is like. I think also the programmers that I've worked with at the National Theatre, they've had this extraordinary number of absolutely brilliant female lighting programmers. People like Jane Dutton and Laura Choules are just extraordinarily good at their jobs. But the kind of gallows humour that has got us through, and also the sort of safe spaces. I mean, I think it's really interesting with what's happened at the National that you create a culture in a programming department that is where there's a kind of a tipping point of the number of women. And of course, that means that other women come into that space and feel it's somewhere they can go. So they've been amazing, and I've learned so much from them. So I just think it's finding people who make you feel safe enough to be honest about what it's like. It's really important to have somewhere to put those thoughts and feelings, and sort of to express the things that you might feel in the back of your head, but don't quite feel able to sort of really articulate. But those kind of emotional darts and arrows that you're just kind of fending off all day, every day, but also finding ways to just actually not apologize for the fact that you have a different way of doing things. That's one of the things that I found really hard growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, was just finding role models who showed me there were different ways to do things. Um, and in a way, I've done that through finding people who work in other disciplines. But yeah, find places you can have an honest conversation about what it is like, and where you can laugh about it. It's really, 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 and be furious about it as well. It's really important. Um, I mean, the other thing I think is really vital is to have other things in your life. I mean, I'm incredibly privileged that I've had two kids and I've got a very long suffering partner, but who has been very supportive about my career, and that obviously that's something that I'm very privileged to have had, and it made it a lot easier for me. Um, but the thing I learned when I had kids was that there was something more important in my life than this job, and I didn't purely define myself through the job. And I think that came for me at a very, very important time. I think if I hadn't learned that, I would have burnt out because I was being so hard on myself about trying to exist in a world where my way of doing it wasn't the valued way of doing it. Um, and also then the directors and producers who employed me, and some of whom made a space where I didn't have to apologize for being me. So find your allies and have other things in your life.